The courtroom was a typical scene for a small town like this where people came to settle minor disputes or face the consequences of their daily missteps. Laura Anderson stood at the back of the courtroom waiting for her name to be called. She had always hated the rigidity of these places, the heavy air, the worn wooden benches, the way the walls seemed to echo with authority, but today it was different. There was a quiet hum of anticipation as she adjusted her jacket and took a deep breath. Her hands were steady, but her mind wandered to the bigger picture. She had an important case to prepare for back in the city, and this small traffic matter felt like a brief interruption in a long and demanding journey. It was hardly worth the time, but she had made it this far. She had always made time for the little things, the details, because they mattered in her world. Every detail added up to something greater. She was not just an attorney. She was a woman with a mission, a vision of justice that extended far beyond the walls of any one courtroom. Judge William Hayes was already seated at the bench, scanning his notes. A thin frown settled on his face as he glanced over the docket for the day. Another full schedule, with nothing too complicated, at least nothing that he thought would be complicated. But then he saw the name Laura Anderson and paused for a moment. His eyes flickered over the paperwork. Her address was unfamiliar to him, but there was something about her name that seemed to ring a bell. Perhaps it was her work, he thought, but he quickly dismissed the notion. It didn't matter. What mattered was the case in front of him, a simple traffic violation, he presumed, and he wasn't in the mood for anything that might challenge the flow of his usual decisions. When Laura's name was called, she stood tall, her presence immediately noticeable. She had a way of carrying herself that commanded respect, even when she was silent. But Judge Hayes didn't notice any of this at first. He saw only a woman standing before him who looked a little too confident, a little too poised, and that rubbed him the wrong way. He didn't like it when people didn't immediately bow to the authority of the courtroom, when they didn't show the right level of respect for the process. To him, she looked like someone trying to avoid responsibility for a minor mistake, the kind of person who believed they could talk their way out of anything. Laura addressed the judge. Her tone measured, her words calm but firm. She explained that she had been traveling for work and hadn't seen the speed limit sign. She didn't contest the fact that she had exceeded the limit, but she felt that the fine was too steep. Given the circumstances, she wasn't making excuses. She was simply trying to make him understand that this was a small mistake made in a big hurry, the kind of mistake anyone could make. But Judge Hayes wasn't interested in understanding. He had already made up his mind about her. He didn't like the way she spoke. He didn't like the way she stood there, unshaken by his gaze. And before he could stop himself, he imposed the full fine, the maximum penalty available to him for the infraction, without any real justification for it. As the words left his mouth, Laura's expression remained unchanged. She nodded once to acknowledge the decision and turned to leave the courtroom as the judge moved on to the next case. But something in the air felt different. A brief moment of tension hung over the room like a weight that couldn't be lifted, and Laura felt that she knew she had been treated unfairly. She had faced this kind of bias before, but she wasn't going to let it derail her. There were bigger things ahead for her, and this moment was nothing more than a small blip in the grand scheme of the work she was set to do. Laura stepped out of the courthouse into the warm midday sun, and for a moment she closed her eyes as if to reset the moment. The exchange with the judge had left a sour taste in her mouth, but she wasn't going to let it linger. She had learned long ago not to let the small injustices of the world weigh her down. Today was a reminder that the fight for fairness was constant, and sometimes it came in the form of a traffic ticket. But her mind wasn't really on the ticket. It was on the cases she was working on back home in the city. She had no time for petty distractions. She had a bigger purpose, and nothing could change that. Not today, not ever. Her car was parked a few blocks down the street. She walked briskly to it, her heels tapping against the pavement. She could feel the weight of the morning's events slipping away as she climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The radio hummed softly as she navigated the quiet streets of the town. And despite the lingering frustration of her encounter with Judge Hayes, she found herself smiling. For a moment, she had worked too hard to let small-minded people dictate her mood. She had seen much worse in her career and had learned to rise above it. But still, the moment was a reminder of the barriers that still existed, even for someone like her, a successful attorney on the cusp of a much bigger achievement. She had worked her way through the legal world with grace and determination, But moments like this reminded her that the road was never smooth, and sometimes the bumps came from the most unexpected places. The drive back to her office was a blur as her thoughts drifted to the nomination that had been kept quiet for months. She had been on the short list for the Supreme Court seat, but until now it had been nothing but whispers in the halls of power. A few trusted individuals knew, but she had kept it private. She didn't want to bring attention to herself until everything was official. But today, as the news began to leak, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. She had worked her whole life for this moment, and now it was real, it was happening. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was watching her every move, every step, and that the pressure was mounting. When she arrived at her office, the phone was already ringing. Her assistant had left a note about a call from a reporter from a local newspaper. They wanted to ask her about the ticket. It was a strange request, but Laura knew better than to ignore the press. They had a way of finding things out one way or another. She picked up the phone and was greeted by a voice that was friendly but inquisitive. The reporter wasted no time in getting to the point, asking her if she had any comment about the fine imposed by Judge Hayes. Laura paused for a moment and then realized what had happened. The story was already out. The judge's decision had stirred something in the community. The reporter mentioned that her name was now circulating as a possible nominee for the Supreme Court, and that the ticket had become a point of interest. People were curious about her and about the man who had fined her so severely when she was so much more than just another person with a simple traffic violation. Laura sat back in her chair, the weight of the conversations settling over her. She hadn't expected any of this, not today, not with everything else going on. But the truth was simple. Judge Hayes had no idea who she was, and now the world was about to find out. Laura hung up the phone slowly as a strange sense of disbelief washed over her. The reporter's words echoed in her mind, and for a moment she wondered if she had misunderstood what she had just heard. Was she really on the verge of something this big? Was this just another coincidence? Or was it fate playing its hand? She had always kept her head down, worked quietly and steadily to make a difference in the legal world and to fight for the causes she believed in, but the idea of being nominated for the Supreme Court felt surreal. It felt like a dream she hadn't even allowed herself to fully envision. She had known the possibility existed, but she hadn't let it sink in, not yet, not until she had confirmation. And now here it was staring her in the face. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her closest colleague and friend, Sarah, who had been with her every step of the way in her career. Sarah had always been the one to keep her grounded, even when the spotlight seemed to find Laura in all the wrong ways. And now the phone call was inevitable. Sarah had heard the news too, but it was clear that Laura's phone had been ringing off the hook with calls from the press. And it wasn't just the traffic ticket they were interested in. It was the whole picture. They wanted to know about the woman who had spent years working behind the scenes on civil rights cases, who had stood up to powerful corporations and fought for those who had no voice. She was the kind of attorney who had built a reputation not through flashy headlines, but through real hard work and dedication to justice. As she sat down at her desk, Laura took a deep breath and stared out the window. The skyline of the city was visible in the distance. But today it felt far away. It felt like the world outside had shifted into something unfamiliar. She turned her attention back to her computer screen, where a news website had already picked up the story with a headline that read ** local attorney under consideration for Supreme Court justice *, and the traffic ticket was mentioned almost as an afterthought beneath it. The article speculated on the significance of the ticket, how it had become a talking point in the community, and the reporter had mentioned how Laura had handled it with grace. The story had already started to gain traction. People were already forming opinions about her, not just based on her work, but on her very existence as a Black woman who had reached the highest levels of legal success and yet had been reduced to a mere traffic violator in the eyes of one judge. Laura's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she read the article, but she quickly closed it. She didn't need to read about herself. She knew what the public would think. She had been through this before. The media would either lift her up as a symbol of success or tear her down as an outsider trying to break into spaces that weren't made for people like her. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of scrutiny, and it wouldn't be the last. Either way, she had always been able to rise above the noise. But something about this moment felt different. It felt like the beginning of something much bigger than a traffic violation. or even a nomination. It felt like a turning point in her life and the life of the nation. Her mind raced as she tried to process everything that was happening. The case she had just won last week, the work she had done on behalf of disenfranchised communities, the relentless push for reform in the criminal justice system. It all seemed to be culminating in this moment. She had never expected this level of attention. But maybe this was what it had been leading to. Maybe this was the test that would prove once and for all what she had always known deep down, that she was ready to fight, not just for her clients, but for a larger purpose that would require every ounce of strength and courage she had within her. The next morning, Laura's office phone rang again, this time with an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of who it might be, but then picked it up. It was a local reporter, a young woman named Emily, who had been following the story about Laura's Supreme Court nomination. Emily asked if Laura had seen the online coverage about her recent traffic ticket and how it was suddenly linked to her potential confirmation. Laura felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest but pushed it down. She hadn't realized how quickly the small incident had turned into a public spectacle. "Yes, I've seen the coverage," Laura replied, her voice calm but measured. "It seems that the press is very interested in this, among other things." The reporter didn't seem to pick up on the hint of irritation in her voice. "I know it's an unusual angle," Emily continued, "but people are curious about you. You've been on the radar for a long time as a rising star in the legal world, and now with your name tied to such an important nomination, it's hard not to ask questions about the details. How do you feel about this unexpected attention?" Laura paused, weighing her response. She wasn't sure how to frame this. On one hand, she didn't want to give this incident more weight than it deserved. On the other, she knew the world was watching, and how she handled this moment could shape the narrative. "I think it's important to remember," Laura said slowly, "that one mistake or one moment doesn't define who a person is, just as a ticket doesn't define my work or my character. I've spent my career fighting for fairness, and that includes holding systems accountable when they fail to deliver it." The reporter was silent for a beat, likely jotting down the words. Emily's tone softened. "That's a strong response, but you must admit, it's striking that someone who's been nominated for the highest court in the land has this sort of run-in with the law. People are going to talk about it." "People talk about everything," Laura said, her voice tightening just slightly. "That doesn't mean it has any real bearing on what's important." She sighed, feeling the weight of this strange new reality settling around her. "But it's not about me anymore. It's about what I stand for, the kind of justice I believe in, the kind of country we should be." Emily seemed to sense the shift in tone and thanked Laura for the conversation, ending the call quickly. Laura sat back in her chair and stared out of her office window, watching the traffic flow below. She didn't know whether to be irritated or amused by how quickly her small-town traffic ticket had spiraled into a public debate. What bothered her more, however, was how quickly Judge Hayes' decision had turned into a focal point for people to judge her when it had been an entirely irrelevant issue in the grand scheme of her life's work. At that moment, her assistant walked into the office holding a stack of files and a note from her legal team. It was a briefing on the status of her nomination process, and there were several calls scheduled for the next few days. As she scanned through the papers, the weight of her nomination loomed large in her mind. She had worked for this opportunity her entire life, but now, with the world scrutinizing every aspect of her journey, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of vulnerability. This wasn't just about being a nominee anymore. It was about standing up to the forces that would try to use anything to undermine her. Laura stood up, resolute, and took a deep breath. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she had never shied away from difficult fights before. If anything, this was just another chapter in a lifelong battle for fairness, and she wasn't about to back down now. Not for a ticket, not for anyone. As the days passed, the story of Laura Anderson's traffic ticket became a growing sensation. News outlets ran feature after feature, some respectful, others less so, each with its own spin on the now famous ticket. Local journalists began digging deeper into her background, highlighting her landmark civil rights cases, her years of dedication to criminal justice reform, and her reputation as one of the brightest legal minds of her generation. But then the inevitable happened. Another angle emerged. The story shifted from her accomplishments to the question of bias. Some articles began to draw attention to Judge Hayes' handling of the case, suggesting that his decision to impose the maximum fine on Laura might have been influenced by unconscious biases. Social media exploded with conversations about the incident, with some commenting on the judge's potentially prejudiced behavior toward a black woman standing before him, a woman who was not just a lawyer, but someone now under consideration for the Supreme Court. Laura's name became a point of division in public discourse. On one side, she was hailed as a trailblazer, a role model for young women, especially black women, striving to make a difference in a system that wasn't built for them. On the other, there were those who questioned her ability to rise to such heights, pointing to the fine as a symbol of her unfitness for the nation's highest court. They used the ticket as a metaphor for her supposed arrogance or entitlement, as if a simple mistake behind the wheel was somehow emblematic of a larger moral failing. Laura's legal team kept a low profile, issuing a brief statement distancing her nomination from the incident, but the noise was unavoidable. Her phone buzzed constantly, emails flooding in from colleagues, friends, and reporters alike, all asking her to comment. The pressure began to mount as she realized the story had moved far beyond the bounds of a traffic infraction. It had become a question of whether she was the right person for the job. Late one evening, after a long day filled with calls and emails, Laura sat down at her kitchen table, staring at the half-empty mug of tea in front of her. The world seemed to be collapsing all around her, her every move dissected in the public eye. She had faced challenges before: racial prejudice, professional setbacks, personal sacrifices, but nothing quite like this. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. It was an unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Laura, it's Sarah." Her friend's voice came through, calm but with an edge of concern. "I think you need to hear something. The judge, Hayes, he's been talking about reaching out to you." "Reaching out to me?" Laura repeated, confused. "Why?" "There's been a lot of chatter," Sarah continued, "about how he handled your case. It's come to light that a few of his colleagues are questioning his decision. I think he's feeling the heat, and he wants to make things right." Laura exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Of all the people she thought might reach out to her, Judge Hayes was not one she'd expected. "I don't need an apology," Laura said softly, her voice steady. "What I need is for the system to change. I need real accountability, not empty gestures." "I get it," Sarah replied, her voice gentle, "but you should at least hear him out. You're in a unique position now. The eyes of the nation are on you, and the way this plays out could send a message about the courts, about justice, about how we treat each other. It could be a moment of real change if you want it to be." Laura stared out the window, the city lights flickering in the distance. Sarah was right. She had always believed that change started with conversations, even uncomfortable ones. She could let this go, let the moment pass, or she could confront it head-on and perhaps use it as an opportunity to push for the reform she had long been fighting for. "I'll hear him out," she said finally, her resolve firming up once more. "But only if he's serious about change. If not, I'll walk away." Sarah's voice softened. "I know you will. But I think you're right. You can turn this into something bigger." With that, Laura set the phone down and took another deep breath. The next few days were going to be crucial. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something greater, and this moment, unexpected as it was, could shape the future of justice in ways she hadn't imagined. The following afternoon, Laura sat in her office, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. She had agreed to meet with Judge Hayes, a man who, just days ago, had treated her like any other defendant in his courtroom, completely unaware of the person sitting before him. Now, with the media frenzy swirling around her and her name trending on every news outlet, the judge was seeking a way to make amends. The call had been short but to the point. Judge Hayes wanted to meet her privately, to explain himself and offer an apology for his decision in her case. Laura wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this meeting could be pivotal not just for her, but for the broader issue of judicial bias and accountability. Her assistant had arranged the meeting at a neutral location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, where they could speak without the prying eyes of the press. Laura arrived early, finding a corner booth that offered some semblance of privacy. She wasn't sure how she felt about this whole thing. It wasn't about the fine anymore. It wasn't about the media circus or the politics of her Supreme Court nomination. It was about integrity, both hers and his, and whether the judge would be able to acknowledge the deeper issues at play. When Judge Hayes walked in, he looked somewhat out of place. The judge, usually a figure of authority in the courtroom, was now a man who seemed unsure of himself, his posture slouched, his expression more somber than usual. He approached the table and extended his hand. Laura hesitated for a moment, then shook it firmly. "I appreciate you meeting with me, Ms. Anderson," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I do owe you an explanation." Laura nodded, her gaze steady. "Go ahead," she said, her tone neutral. "I've read a lot about you in the past few days." Hayes began, his eyes meeting hers. "I knew you were an accomplished lawyer, but I had no idea who you were when you walked into that courtroom. And that was a mistake. A big mistake." He paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I judged you based on assumptions, and I didn't give you the respect you deserve. I treated you like any other person who came before me that day, but you weren't just any other person. I didn't realize I was judging someone who has worked tirelessly for equality, for justice, and it's clear now that I failed to see the bigger picture." Laura listened in silence, weighing his words. She wasn't sure if his apology was motivated by guilt or by the mounting pressure from the public and his peers, but she couldn't afford to let that cloud her judgment. She had to focus on whether this was a genuine attempt at growth, at understanding, or whether it was just a political move. "I appreciate you saying that, Judge," Laura said finally, her voice calm. "But words are just words. What matters now is action. If we really want to make change, it's not about saying sorry. It's about doing better. It's about recognizing that the justice system and the people who administer it need to confront their biases. We can't continue to act as though these problems don't exist, because they do, and they impact real lives." Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I know," he said quietly. "I've been reading more, talking to colleagues. I've been having some difficult conversations about bias in the courtroom, and I realize now that I need to do more than just acknowledge it. I need to act on it. It's not enough to just say it's there. I need to work toward making the system better, not just for people like you, but for everyone." Laura studied him closely. There was something different in his eyes now, something that told her this wasn't just about appeasing the media or saving face. For the first time, it felt like Judge Hayes was confronting the truth of what she had been saying all along, about systemic bias, about how his position of power could inadvertently reinforce harmful stereotypes, about how people like her, and so many others, were treated unfairly every day in courts across the country. "I'm glad to hear that," Laura said after a long pause. "But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about this, then start by reflecting on your own decisions, by holding yourself accountable in real ways. The legal system isn't just about following the letter of the law. It's about creating a space where fairness is the foundation, not an afterthought." Hayes nodded, a heavy silence settling between them. "You're right. I will. And I promise you, I will work to be better. I won't make that mistake again." Laura studied his face for a moment, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't sure if he was fully there yet, but she saw something, a willingness to learn, to change. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "I hope you do," she said softly, standing up. "I'll hold you to it." As she walked away from the table, Laura felt a mix of emotions, relief, uncertainty, and a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure where this would all go, but for the first time in a while, she felt like she had made a small but significant difference. Perhaps this conversation, this apology, could ripple out in ways she hadn't imagined. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something larger than herself. The meeting with Judge Hayes weighed heavily on Laura in the days that followed. It wasn't the apology itself that had impacted her the most, but the subtle shift that had occurred in the conversation, the acknowledgement of bias, the genuine remorse in his eyes, and his promise to do better. It was rare, in her experience, for someone in a position of power to admit their mistakes so openly, especially when those mistakes had the potential to be exposed publicly. And yet she couldn't help but feel a cautious optimism. The judge wasn't perfect, and neither was the system he represented. But perhaps, just perhaps, this could be a turning point. The media attention surrounding her traffic ticket had continued to swirl, but now there was a subtle shift in tone. The headlines had evolved, focusing less on her fine and more on her character, her career, and the broader implications of her Supreme Court nomination. Some outlets began to explore the real issue, the systemic biases that still plagued the courts, the challenges that Black women faced in their professional lives, and the necessity of reforming a justice system that often operated in ways that were deeply unjust. Laura had spent years advocating for these causes, but now, as her name became more well-known, the platform she had always hoped for was suddenly at her fingertips. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with calls from the media, colleagues, and even political figures. Some were congratulatory, offering their support as her name gained momentum in the public eye. Others were more pointed, asking difficult questions about her readiness for the Supreme Court. Laura had never been someone to shy away from hard questions, but the weight of those now seemed heavier than ever. The pressure was mounting. One afternoon, she received an unexpected call from an old friend, Congressman Thomas Riley, a longtime ally in her fight for criminal justice reform. His voice was warm and familiar, but there was a distinct note of urgency in his tone. "Laura, I need you to be careful," he said, cutting straight to the point. "The situation with Judge Hayes, it's becoming a bigger story than you might realize. It's not just about your nomination anymore. Some people are trying to frame this as a personal attack, questioning your integrity, your qualifications. They're painting you as a political pawn. You need to stay ahead of this narrative." Laura paused, digesting his words. She had expected the political games, the pushback from those who didn't want to see her succeed, but this was something different. This was a deliberate attempt to undermine her, to shift the conversation away from her qualifications and the pressing need for systemic change and onto something personal. "Have you seen the latest polls?" Riley continued. "There's a concerted effort to create doubt about your character, to question your ability to handle the pressure. They're not just attacking your nomination, they're attacking you as a person." "I've seen it," Laura said quietly, "but I can't control what others say or do. All I can do is stay focused on what matters, the work, the issues that have been ignored for too long." "You're right, of course, but you need to be prepared," Riley warned. "There's an old guard in Washington that doesn't want to see change, and they'll use anything they can to discredit you. The question now is, how do you fight back without letting them dictate the narrative? How do you turn this around?" Laura sat back in her chair, thinking deeply. Riley was right. This was bigger than her. This was about the people she had spent her career fighting for, the communities whose voices were often silenced in the corridors of power. The fight for fairness and justice wasn't just a personal crusade. It was a movement that had to be carried forward, no matter the obstacles. "I'll fight back," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not going to fight on their terms. I'm going to continue fighting for the causes I've always fought for, and I'll let my work speak for itself. If they want to question my qualifications, let them. I know who I am, and I know what I stand for. If they want to focus on the small stuff, on my traffic ticket, or on anything else, they'll find themselves missing the bigger picture." Riley seemed to approve of her response, though his voice softened. "I knew you'd say that. Just remember, Laura, you're not alone in this. People are watching, and they're listening. Don't let anyone make you doubt your place in this fight." As they ended the call, Laura felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead was only going to get harder, but she was ready. She had faced harder battles before, and each time, she had come out stronger. Now, more than ever, she understood that her fight wasn't just for her career. It was for the countless individuals who had been overlooked and marginalized by the very system she was on the verge of joining. This was bigger than a ticket, bigger than a nomination. It was a fight for justice, and she would not back down. The days turned into weeks, and the media frenzy surrounding Laura's nomination and the controversy over her traffic ticket showed no signs of slowing down. The pressure was relentless. Every day brought new challenges, more questions, and more scrutiny. But Laura, determined as ever, refused to let the noise distract her. She kept her focus on the work that mattered, her ongoing efforts to reform the criminal justice system, her legal cases, and the people she had fought for over the years. The pressure might have been mounting, but so too was her resolve. Despite the increasing attacks on her character, something began to shift. The more the media tried to paint her as a symbol of political agendas or personal failures, the more the public seemed to rally behind her. It was as though the public had been waiting for someone like Laura, someone unafraid to challenge the system, to push for change, and to speak out against the injustices that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The coverage of her nomination transformed from sensationalism to a deeper focus on the issues she represented. Support began flooding in from unexpected corners. Activists who had followed her career for years rallied around her. Leaders in the civil rights movement, who had long admired her work, spoke out in her favor. And even some of her harshest critics softened, acknowledging that while they disagreed with her politics, they respected her integrity and her commitment to justice. In a meeting with her legal team, Laura reflected on the incredible momentum that had been building. "This isn't just about me anymore," she said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "This is about creating space for the people who have been unheard, for the communities that have been ignored for too long. If I'm confirmed, it won't just be a win for me. It'll be a win for everyone who believes in the power of real change." Her team agreed, and with each passing day, it became clear that the narrative was shifting in her favor. Public opinion was no longer centered on the traffic ticket or the petty controversies. Instead, it focused on her qualifications, her experience, and her unwavering commitment to reforming the legal system. More and more, people were starting to see Laura as the beacon of hope she had always strived to be. One evening, as Laura sat alone in her office, reviewing case files for an upcoming trial, she was interrupted by a call from her assistant. It was time for the confirmation hearings. She had been preparing for this moment for months, but now that it was finally here, she couldn't help but feel a nervous anticipation. This was the moment that could shape her future, the future of the court, and the future of justice in the country. The confirmation hearings were scheduled to begin in a few days, and already the buzz in Washington was palpable. The question on everyone's mind: would Laura Anderson be the first Black woman nominated to the Supreme Court? It was a historic moment, one that had the potential to define an era of change. Laura took a deep breath and looked out of the window. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the city. It felt as though the weight of the world had been placed squarely on her shoulders, but in that moment, she also felt something else: hope. Hope that change was possible. Hope that her fight for justice could inspire others to continue the work. And most importantly, hope that this moment, this opportunity, was the beginning of a future where fairness and equity weren't just ideals, but realities for everyone. As she prepared to step into the hearings, Laura knew that no matter what happened next, she had already won. Not in the sense of a confirmation or a title, but in the way she had stood firm in her values, faced every challenge head-on, and refused to be defined by the mistakes of others. She had proved that justice wasn't just something you fought for, it was something you lived by. And in that, Laura Anderson had already made her mark.